and see if we can't remember. So what was Merton saying, guys, at the end of last class's lecture? What was Merton saying about crime or deviance in general? What causes it?
He said there was like a contradiction between like the means and the ends.
Yeah, and what does that mean? Probably should have been looking for a hand raised. Somebody raised their hand. What does that mean? A contradiction between means and ends. What are our means and what are our ends?
The ends are like the goals that we were supposed to set, and the means are the ways that we get to.
Yeah, our ends are the goals. What was the goals though?
Money.
Yeah. And what was the means? Yeah, jobs, hard work. We talked about the contradictions. So between that being that what can't you often achieve through hard work? It's obvious if it's contradiction, right? Well, somebody said, what can't you achieve?
Money.
Yeah, you can't achieve money through hard work always. You know, you don't have that much control over it. So I think we got through the top two, right? Isn't that what we?
And the bottom one.
What are the bottom ones?
Yeah.
Which one did we get to?
Rituals.
Ritualism. So just to make sure we're all on the same page. How do each of these work? So what do conformists do? Go ahead, Charles.
Make money and have a job.
Yeah, they make money and they work at their job. They have the means to do that, so they can just conform, and they do. What do ritualists do?
It's like they work hard, but they might not make a lot of money.
Yeah, they embrace the ethic of working hard, but they reject the goal of making money. So what might be an example of somebody doing that? What was some of the examples we settled on, or a new example? People who work hard.
Like somebody that has a job but doesn't save any money.
So yeah, somebody who, I guess like somebody who just spends their money might be a good example of that. What might be another example? What other, yeah, go ahead.
Kind of like sucky jobs, like working at a restaurant or something like that.
Yeah, some people who don't make very much money, but they'll still like work hard in those jobs. Yeah, that would be an example. Some people don't want to make money, right, but they work hard. What might be an example of somebody who has a job where they work really hard and make very little money?
Like a missionary.
Missionaries, yeah, missionaries are a good example. Our department has a relationship with a missionary group, Simple House in Kansas City, that helps the poor, right? They basically live without making any money at all in this sort of like communal housing network, right? They work hard, right? So they accepted the means, but they rejected the ends. Social workers, I think social workers are kind of like this. Professors are kind of like this, right? So there's a lot of people who believe in hard work, but they don't necessarily try to achieve the ends of making money, which means that they've gotten rid of the contradiction, which makes it easier for them to live within, right, this contradictory society that tells us that you have to do both of these things, right? Innovation, what do you do when you innovate?
Create.
What's that?
Create.
Or within Merton's, what do innovators do?
You make money, but you don't work for it.
Yeah, you reject the means of hard work, but you accept the goals of making a lot of money. And what may be examples of innovation? Which people innovate in our society? Drug dealers would be a great example of it, which is kind of funny to be like, they're an innovator, right? Because we attach a positive label to that often. Yeah. Any sort of crime that's not like, that's generally revolves around making a lot of money, right, would be a form of innovation. And that's kind of where one of the places where we see within Merton's theory of deviance, right, There's something deviant to being a ritualist, right? But it's not criminal deviance. It's just like rejecting money is not something that's very popular with people. You know, often people are made uncomfortable by people who do that even, you know. Or an innovator where you get crime. What might be another example that maybe something not criminal would be an example of an innovator?
Marrying rich.
Marrying rich.
Getting an inheritance.
Getting an inheritance. What else?
Social media.
Yeah. Some people who try to use social media platforms to make more money or get a lot of visibility. Yeah, that's a good example. Or like the more dark side of that, internet trolls, right? Who try to do the same thing, but they basically get people fighting and create controversy, right? So like anybody who you can think about who wants to be wealthy and has tried to find a different way of doing it would be an innovator. Okay, so you can do one more thing. What's the last thing we haven't talked about yet that you can do? What's the last square? What are they doing with the means and the ends? They reject both, right? This is somebody who is referred to as an escapist. So an escapist rejects both. And technically, so does something else. There's another category, but we'll get to that. Tag-on category. So what may be an example of somebody who rejects both the idea of becoming wealthy and the means of working hard? What are some people who don't work hard and don't try to be wealthy?
Oh, this one doesn't apply to women.
Oh. Anyone else? What groups of people in our society?
Homeless people.
Yeah, homeless people have often gotten to the point where they don't think that they're ever going to be wealthy, and they don't necessarily work hard. Not necessarily because they don't want to. And actually, homeless people constantly talk about working. If you've ever known any homeless people, they're always trying to get jobs. Anyways, other people.
Like drifters.
Drifters. Drug addicts. You know, a lot of times have rejected both. Hippies living in communes, right? All these people they're deviant in some ways, right? But like they've definitely, because they've rejected it, but yeah, so that's, those would be examples. Or you can have a fourth category, which he describes as rebellion. In rebellion, it's essentially that you are you're like an escapist, right? And that you reject both, but you've transplanted it with new goals and means, right? So essentially rebellion and trying to alter the society often replaces it with different goals and means. So these would be things like people who belong to political movements, right? Protesters would be an example of this, or like flat out like revolutionaries, right? Like they don't want to make money, they don't want to work, they don't believe in the ethic of working hard per se, but they do believe in other things very strongly, right? They have different goals in mind and different ways of achieving it. They take up their time and thought and energy. Oh, that makes sense? Okay, there's one other standard theory of crime that I was going to talk about, which is anime theory. So this was called strain theory, and it was Merton. Just to repeat that again, since I didn't write it up there. This last one's been around a while. You see it a lot being used a lot still. You also hear it in other parts of sociology, so it's worth kind of hesitating on it, particularly things about modernity and urbanization and stuff like that. We'll often utilize Durkheim. He's one of we have something, we refer to them as classical sociologists, so like sociology has sort of like its traditional old canon, and Durkheim's one of them, Emil Durkheim. Unlike other fields which have a long history, sociology only dates back to the 20th century, so these are fairly new figures in that way. They're not like ancient or anything. So Durkheim's particularly interested in how modernity changes patterns of life. ways people think and how those things often create stress on people. So that's kind of his main thrust. And Durkheim's book that's used mostly in criminology is a book called Suicide, or Deviance in general. There's a book called Suicide. So how do we normally like to think and talk about suicide? What causes people to commit suicide? A whole bunch of things.
Depression.
Depression.
They don't see like worth or value in their life.
They what?
They don't see worth or value in like them being alive.
Yeah, they don't see worth or value in their life. Generally, we view it as something very personal, right? And we don't, that's kind of like what you were saying with a lot of things, right? We view it as a personal thing. Durkheim was interested in trying to find patterns of suicide. And so what he did is he essentially mapped who it was within a population who did or didn't commit suicide. So there's things like wealthy people are more likely to commit suicide than poor people, right? Protestants were more likely at his time to commit suicide than Catholics in France, right? People in the military were more likely to commit suicide than people who weren't, right? And so basically his point is this: you can explain an individual suicide at a personal level, but if you take it and you look at the patterns of it, there's obviously something bigger going on, right? And that's basically kind of, if we think of where we started in sociology, time, place, and structure. It's kind of what Durkheim's basically doing here, right? He's basically saying that you could take something like suicide and map it and understand it, right, at a macro level, at the level of institutions and things like that, right? And so he for suicide, Durkheim ends up with creating a sort of schematic or map of why people commit suicide. And there's two things he thinks are really related to it. And he calls it integration and regulation. So by integration, Durkheim just means that how connected you are. How connected you are to your society. How connected you are to the other people around you, things like that, right? By regulation, he means how rigid are the rules of your society. And so what Durkheim wants to claim is that you can have either too much or too little of either of these. So you can have too much integration, you can have too little integration, or you can have too much regulation or too little regulation. Make sense so far? And he has different names for each of these. So he calls somebody who commits suicide because he's too integrated, he refers to this as altruistic suicide. And so for Durkheim, also each of these are going to have different kinds of societies that or even within a society, different areas of that society, right, which lend themselves to certain types of suicide. So what may be an example of somebody who commits suicide because he's too connected to the people around them, he or she is too connected to the people around them, or too connected to their society. So this is not how we often want to talk about it. Can anybody think about, maybe from other cultures, examples of suicide? Cases of suicide or types of suicide? Yeah.
Could like Hitler be one? Or no?
Yeah, I think that could work, right? It's not that he's too disconnected, it's that he can't view himself outside of that political movement, so he kills himself when he fails, you know? That would be a good example, yeah.
This might be far-fetched, but like, I know in like really ancient Japanese culture, it was like, if you failed or something like that, it was seen as like really bad, and it's more honorable for you to like kill yourself in battle than like have someone else kill you. And so like, it was seen as an honorable thing to do.
Yeah, and that's kind of the classic example, yeah, somebody killing themselves out of honor, right? This could also be things like suicide bombing, right? You're connected enough within your society that you're just willing to do that for it. So like, you know, suicide bombers in terms of like things like terrorists are so connected to, you know, the Islamic faith, to their church group, to the political movements that they belong to within that they're willing to just kill themselves, right? So that would be an example of an altruistic suicide. On the other end, you have an egoistic suicide. So might be an example of somebody committing suicide because they are not connected enough to society, to the society they live in. What might that look like? This is a little closer to how we often think about suicide. What do you guys think? What would that look like?
Someone who doesn't really like have friends, I guess.
Yeah, somebody who doesn't have very many friends, doesn't have a job, doesn't have anything going for them, right? That's kind of like one of our standard tropes of people who would commit suicide, right? That is a form of egoistic suicide, right? Okay. In terms of regulation, you can commit suicide because there's not enough regulation in your society, right? You don't feel like you essentially. Has anybody taken a philosophy class yet? Anybody ever talk about existentialism in a philosophy class? There's this person named Sartre who's obsessed with like how depressing freedom is because like you constantly have to be making choices and decisions, right? That nothing's set up for you, so you're just sort of like always having to deal with the fact that you're going to make decisions but not know the outcome, so it's like this constant stress. So you can think about like whenever you stress over your choices, right? In a society where there's very little rules and regulations, you're constantly having to make choices, not knowing how that's going to work out, right? You could be really stressed out about that. That would be an example of something that would be a anomic form of suicide. Right? Nothing to ground your identity in, nothing, right? Like that's kind of like the idea, right? So if you end up just sort of like floating out in space, you might commit sort of like an anomic suicide. So what might be an example of somebody, and I think anime and egoism kind of are interrelated. So what might be an example of somebody committing an anomic suicide? What do you think? Too little regulation. Not enough rules. Fan of the long pause until somebody answers. So like one of Durkheim's examples would be people who move around a lot have a tendency to commit suicide, right? People who immigrate from one place to another have a tendency to commit suicide as well, right? And you think about like being taken out of your original society. You may be connected, have friends, know people, right? But like your life isn't very structured, right? And you kind of like fail to have that, right? And that could be an example of anomic. This one I think is the hardest one to understand, right? But it's a anomic suicide. Okay, and then on the opposite of an anomic suicide is that you have a fatalistic suicide. This is where you commit suicide because you have too many rules in your life. What might be an example of somebody who commits suicide because their life has too many rules or it's too regulated?
Would it be like if like a prisoner kills himself?
Yeah. Prisoners have a high suicide rate, and that's an example of that, right? Their lives are too structured, right? Same thing with like, and you could argue a chicken and egg thing, but like mental patients, right? You could argue that they have a feeling of being too regulated. I think this is, oh, go ahead.
I just feel like there's also like kids who like grow up in a really strict household or like things like that where they just feel controlled and they can't get out of it. So.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and that is one of the populations that commit suicide the most is teenagers. Why is that? Right? Well, teenagers are essentially just adults that have to live like children under their parents, right? Like, it's kind of like one of these weird anomalies that only exist in modern society, where you have adults living under really heavy regulation, right? That's, you could argue that's one of the reasons why the suicide rate is really high for teenagers, right? Well, that makes sense? So this one, as is very much so a theory of deviance, right? How do you explain these sort of behaviors, right? People use this a lot for crime, though, in the idea that if people are connected within our society, so within Durkheim's analysis, this is one thing I have to say before we talk about crime. Which end of this do you think are more common in our society? Yeah, these two, right? These are modern. These are more common in pre-modern societies, right? In pre-modern societies, it's more common to commit suicide for altruistic and fatalistic reasons. Right? We can think of examples from our own society, but we strain a little to do it. So, a lot of criminologists will use this as a platform for talking about crime. Do you guys, because essentially they want to say that like criminal deviance works almost the same way as suicide, right? People are more likely to commit crimes if they're not really integrated into the society, and they're more likely to commit crimes if they live lives that are kind of under-regulated, right? Does that make sense? So it's looking at like, another way to put it for Durkheim, to understand crime or deviance, we have to understand it is embedded within modern societies. Our society causes its own special version of deviance, right? That doesn't mean that other societies don't have their own forms of deviance, but they're different, right? Our society to some degree generates or creates crime and deviance, right? Does it make sense? Okay, so that's Durkheim. Any questions or thoughts about more traditional theories of criminology? Okay, cool. Let's go ahead and start talking about an article then. So we'll start out with this Unsettled Times article. Indigenous incarceration and links between colonialism and the penitentiary in Canada. So first, what do you guys know about colonialism? Have you guys at least seen this word before? What sort of things do you think about when you think of colonialism?
Like Africa.
You think about Africa, yeah, the scramble for Africa is sometimes called. When in the 19th century, Europe took over Africa. What else? What did people do during colonialism? What was the point of it? Anybody know? There's a difference between what we said it was about and what it actually was about. Why do you colonize entire continents? Yeah, and a lot of times people will refer to colonialism as a resource extraction regime. How do you go about extracting resources from another continent? What was the methods used during colonialism?
Take over.
Yeah, you used military power and violence to take over large swaths of land to get resources to become more wealthy as countries. Right? That's essentially the project of colonialism. Anybody know kind of how long colonialism lasted, when it started, when it ended? Arguably hasn't ended yet.
Like during the Industrial Revolution.
It's even before that. In fact, yeah, you probably wouldn't have had the Industrial Revolution if it wasn't for colonialism, because it brought all those resources in and allowed that sort of production to happen.
So like, I don't know,
Like
I feel like
1840.
1200 is too early.
What's that?
I said 1200 sounds a little too early, but.
Did you? What'd you say?
I just said 1540.
Yeah, that's pretty close. Yeah, we all had to memorize a date.
1492.
1492. What happened in 1492?
Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean.
Yeah, so if you want to think about that in your mind as like the start date of colonialism, like that's really kind of pretty accurate, right? So initially colonialism starts with Spain, right? And then several other countries, right? The Dutch were predominant after that, the English and the French, right? And so essentially it's these resource extraction regimes. What happens to the indigenous population of places that get taken over during colonialism?
They get wiped out.
They get wiped out, run out, or they get turned into labor, right? That's basically, what's that?
Oh, I said they get turned into slaves.
Yeah, basically. Slaves are some form of forced labor, right? So that's the setting here, is essentially like colonialism. There's one particular form of colonialism called settler colonialism, which this article is particularly interested in. Settler colonialism. Settler colonialism is essentially colonialism where people settle from Europe, right? So can anybody think of an example of a settler colony? Yeah, us. We are a settler colony, right? So usually settler colonies are accompanied by a specific type of policy. It's pretty important historically. So what populations predominantly live in North America now?
Europeans.
Europeans. Why is that?
Those are the main immigrants.
Because we killed everybody else. Right? Settler colonialism is usually accompanied with genocide. Right? It's usually accompanied with genocide. Not to put it like too bluntly, but us as a place, right? The United States, essentially we are a country founded on genocide and slavery. And I don't think that's taking things too strongly. In fact, if you want to understand, like in modern world history, right, this process of colonialism, essentially Europe taking over the rest of the world, killing off massive amounts of its population and extracting resources from it, it's probably the single most important thing for understanding modern history, right? It's the single most important event. If you want to understand why European countries are wealthier, and why they predominate over the rest of the world, it's because of colonialism. If you want to understand why other countries are poor, it's because of colonialism. If you want to understand why there's racism, we'll get to racism later, right? But the concept of race doesn't exist until colonialism. It's born out of it, right? Particularly it's born out of the act of committing genocide. You can't kill off entire populations of people you think are your equal, right? So like racism grows out of genocide. Okay, does all that make sense? That's just kind of background to make sure we know what's happening. So, okay. So how are we tying, and I'm thinking particularly here at page 68. Anybody catch how our author is connecting connecting the Canadian, in this case, penal system, right? By penal system, what do we mean? Prisons. We already talked about prisons a little bit, right? This is a slightly different reading, but also kind of close to the other reading we had about prisons were when we were talking about Foucault a couple weeks ago, right? So how is he connecting this with colonialism? What's the connection here? What does our author want us to realize about colonialism in Canada? Or the history of colonialism in Canada?
You criminalize those that you want to exterminate.
Well, it's a little bit slower process. Our author's trying to claim that colonialism never ended. Right? That it's actually still going on. Right? And you may primarily see colonialism still going on via prison systems. The same argument gets made about the United States, in particular in terms of the incarceration of African Americans. And we'll get to that in a little bit. So it's the idea that like, this is kind of, that by framing colonialism as over, right, we perpetuate it. So by framing colonialism as something that happened long ago in the past, it allows essentially more powerful countries or more powerful populations within a country to essentially ignore the fact that they're still doing things that could very much so be seen as resource extraction. A good example of this. Has anybody here ever been to an Indian reservation? Who owns, most of the Indian reservations in the United States, who owns the land?
European.
So the government?
The government owns the land. The Native Americans who live on their land don't own it, right? So I spent a summer on an Apache reservation in New Mexico. And quite literally, like, the government can walk in and just be like, oop, we want some piece of mineral underneath your guys' houses, and they'll just tear down an entire neighborhood, an entire town. They'll just kick everybody out, tear it down, right? Why is that? It's because they actually still own it, right? So here you kind of see like, you do have people using Indian reservations for resource extraction all the time. It's not something that happened in the past. A good example of this, does anybody know what predominantly people on, has anybody ever heard anything about like the Navajo reservation, particularly illness on the Navajo reservation in the United States? Are you familiar with this history? Most people die very young on the Navajo reservation from cancer. And the reason why is because the US government used the Navajo reservation to test nuclear weapons. Right? Same sort of thing, right? The United States allows itself, and so the same thing is happening in Canada in a lot of ways, right? You get indigenous populations often being placed in very vulnerable positions so that continued resource extraction can occur, right? Money can be made off of the situation. And so like, within this framing, right, like we officially as the US government apologized for the Indian Wars and killing off the Indians out west, right? And so has Canada, right? But we frame it as something that happened in the past, which keeps us from having to think about it in the present. Does anybody see a parallel here with race in the United States outside of Indian reservations? How do we talk about particularly racism in the United States often? How do we talk about racism in the United States? There's a connection to be made here. What sort of things do we associate with racism?
I feel like sometimes it's talked about like racism ended like when slavery ended, but I don't think that's honestly how it is.
Yeah, we talk about it. I think of it often in terms of like civil rights movements,
Yeah.
right? We often talk like racism ended after the civil rights movement of the 1960s, right? But it hasn't. It continues to go on. It's self-perpetuating. But by framing it as something in the past, it allows us to disassociate what we currently do from older, earlier policies, things like segregation, right? And this is very common, so tying this back to colonialism again, this is very common in most places where settler colonialism happened. So, is anybody aware of like anything about the history of like South Africa? This is getting long enough ago. History is in before 1990.
Wasn't like, didn't the English like take over basically the lower half of South Africa and colonize it?
So yeah, it was colonized by the English and somebody before that. The Dutch colonized it. And but there's a policy, a specific policy that started in like the 70s.
I know what you're talking about, I'm just trying, can't remember what.
Apartheid.
Apartheid. Does anybody know what an apartheid is? Anybody know what that is? Do you have a clue what it is?
Remember?
You just know the word?
Yeah.
It was like middle school.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's essentially apartheid was a system where they allowed certain people from certain races to live in certain places and work in certain places and others in others, right? So like white South Africans that were of English descent lived in certain parts of the country, indigenous people lived in certain parts of the country, right? And even within towns, often divvied up. Did we practice something similar to that in the United States? We don't call it apartheid. Segregation is the same, basically the exact same logic, right? You can live in this neighborhood and you can live in this neighborhood, but you can't live in each other's, right? You can go to this school and you can go to this school, but you can't go to each other's, right? Here's a harder question. Do we still have segregation in the United States? Yeah. I mean, like, does anybody here ever listen to NPR? National Public Radio? I had this really interesting interview with a linguist who was saying that the English language in the United States is shifting by race more, so that people actually spoke closer to the same English during segregation than they do today. Why is that, do you think? What would that point to? Segregation never ended, right? We're just as segregated as we were back then, and over time our languages split further apart because nothing changed. So the legal system changes, but the results remain the same. Okay. Getting back to, so what happens, in same logic as segregation, what happens to Native Americans as a result of the Indian Wars? Besides genocide, killing off, most of the population, 90% of the population. Shooting men, women, and children with Gatling guns and things like that, What's the outcome?
We get moved.
Where do they get put? Not North Carolina. Yeah, all over the West. Some things out east. Where do they get placed?
The terrible lands, like, that aren't, you can't really grow anything there. They just sort of stuck in there because nobody was going to inhabit those anyways.
Yeah. What do we call those places? Indian reservations. They have the same thing in Canada. So initially, could Indians leave the reservation? No, they had to stay on their reservation. They were not allowed to leave the reservation, right? Just as like African Americans had to stay in certain neighborhoods, right? This is a very common logic. Okay. So we've talked about all this, but we haven't talked about crime and we haven't talked about the penal system. So what's the connection here?
Colonization is using, or like taking over and having power to extract goods. Like the penal system, a lot of times there's like prison labor. So that would be your goods would be labor, and it's relatively free considering the people are in prison and they can't do anything about it.
Yeah, so you have the prison. There's been a lot of talk recently about things like for-profit prisons, right? But also like even like because of like subcontractors, you know, prisons in America often make a lot of money, even if they're publicly owned, even if they're government owned. There's something in the sociology of economics, they call this coerced consumption. You could argue that the prison population in the United States generates money because they have to consume what they're told to consume, right? Which essentially allows this sort of like forced consumption. So yeah, that's one way you could connect that. How else is it interconnected? This is our article talks about like the logics of colonialism. How do you see a similar logic to colonialism in prisons? First of all, not to be blunt, who is in prisons in the United States and in Canada? Yeah, and in fact, like increasingly so. So in the 1960s, the prison population actually reflected the actual general population. So the white people were just as likely in the United States to be imprisoned as black people. Is that true anymore? No, it's horribly not true, right? Prisons are predominantly places where in the United States we house black and Latino people, right? That's really what we do there. What in Canada, it's a little bit different situation. Who goes to prison in Canada?
Indigenous people.
Indigenous peoples, right? Inuits, right? Controversial term, but generally thought of to be polite. Anyways, Inuit populations primarily occupy Canadian prisons, right? How do we see, so it's the same population as what was happening in colonialism. What do we do in prisons? What do you do? What do prisons look like? What does population in a prison do? I'll phrase it a little bit differently. So we were talking about apartheid, we could also think of things like slavery. How is prison system similar to that? So how is it similar to what you do in colonization?
It labels a certain group of people.
It creates a difference between certain groups of people. It reinforces those differences over time in a hierarchical way.
There's like different types of prison, like there's ones for like white collar crimes and then just regular prisons.
Yeah, so the prison system itself is like segregated into different categories, right? It's also in itself still just sort of a continuing form of segregation, right? And it also continues the same amount of violence, right? It's very similar insofar as we enact violence on people in prisons. So the same population as before is placed in violent situations and has violence acted upon them, much like they did before. So we could just view prisons as the continuation of colonialism. And that's kind of what the article's trying to say, that it really is, right? So things haven't changed as much as we think that they have. We've just hidden it. And essentially now we can just blame people for being imprisoned, even though it's the same population that we were doing this to before. Yeah?
Do you think we're more racist now than we were before segregation? Or do you think it's still the same?
I think what they generally are, like generally what people will say is that racism becomes quieter, right? But it doesn't become less or more, right? So we're quieter about our racism. We have like polite racism, but the consequences largely remain the same. Okay, I have to end there because I have to drive to the top of the hill and evaluate another professor. So we have to sit in on each other's classes. It's kind of a, thing. So.
I don't know if you have back to
Sorry to like